Supermarkets have faced significant scrutiny recently. There are concerns that they're price gouging and profiteering and throwing consumers and suppliers under the bus. There are concerns about their political stances, and in Woolworths' case, this involves the voice referendum and their stance in relation to Australia Day. This came to a head when the Woolworths CEO was simply unable to deal with valid questions about supermarket competition and their activities. This was on ABC's Four Corner program, and he simply didn't handle all of the criticisms that were thrown at him. Here is the full exchange. It was a train wreck.
Okay, can we take that out? Is that okay? He is retired, but I shouldn't have said that, Angus. Are we going to leave it in there if we are?
Well, if we're on the record. You said it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think I'm done, guys. I do this with good intent. I don't do this with bad intent.
This, of course, catalyzed the Woolworths CEO stepping down, something that allegedly was already in the works but had not yet really been announced or necessarily decided upon. It's clear that the backlash surrounding this interview and surrounding how he handled it really spearheaded the decision to get rid of him. But let's be clear, this was an abysmal performance regardless of the situation. It was truly catastrophically bad for any CEO. But regardless, let's look at the situation with these supermarkets and see whether there's actually any meat to the story. Because we need to analyse whether or not there truly is anti-competitive behaviour, or whether supermarkets are just a scapegoat. After all, a lot of the allegations came about from the government, using the supermarkets as a scapegoat for inflation, trying to deflect the blame from themselves, trying to distract Australians from the government's failing. It's almost as if the government is trying to create a smokescreen. The government is trying to blame someone else for everyone's ills. The government is effectively trying to find a boogeyman that they can paint as the bad guy, so that the government can come across as the saviour that is helping Australians get on top of the cost of living. Australians can see through this, so it's worth looking a little bit into this. So let's have a look at the supermarket profits. But they're not in fact as egregious as Anthony Albanese seems to make them out to be. In the first half of 2024 fiscal year, from July to December 2023, Woolworths actually lost money, as net income was negative $781 million. However, a large portion of this was attributable to significant or unusual items. Excluding these, the net income was around $929 million. Now that sounds like a large amount of money. However, we need to put this into perspective, because what we really need to consider is how profitable the supermarkets are. Not in raw dollar terms, but in percentage terms. That is, how much of the revenue they generate is actually profits. And perhaps the expenses for these supermarkets are also incredibly high, which it turns out is the case. So let's have a look at this. Woolworths' profit margin was actually 2.7%. So, wow, it has made a net income in the last half of $929 million excluding significant items. Its profit margin is not large, and that profit margin has been pretty constant for a couple of years now. This means that Woolworths is susceptible to a major economic downturn. Coles is similar. In fiscal year 2023, Coles' profit margin was 2.6%. However, the median profit margin for the ASX 200 is around 7%. Now, obviously, different industries have different appropriate profit margins. However, a profit margin of 2.7% doesn't leave much buffer for cost increases. That is, if rent goes up across the board, or if labour goes up across the board, or if there's an increase in supply costs in general, then they could easily end up not profitable. I.e., Coles and Woolworths need to pass on their inflation to consumers lest they end up making a loss and eventually going bankrupt. The profit margin of 2.7% is simply not that high. Now granted, we might argue that Woolworths has wasted money on political shenanigans and other things that they really didn't need to spend money on. They could trim the fat. However, there's only so much fat to trim. And say we're looking at a 2.7% profit margin, then even excluding food from the inflation calculus, inflation has gone up by more than 2.7%. So if the supermarkets don't pass on inflation to consumers, well, they'll end up potentially making a loss. Now, like I said, they could trim waste and excess. Woolworths did not need to get involved in the voice referendum. Woolworths did not need to have an own goal by alienating some of its customers over the voice, over things like reconciliation and its approach thereto, over the Australia Day shenanigans and issues. Woolworths did not need to engage in a lot of divisive things that they did. They could have stuck to just selling groceries, and that would have gone down much better with Australians, particularly those Australians that rejected the voice referendum. And those Australians are typically the ones who are living outside of the inner city areas. And therefore Woolworths could have done itself a favour by not getting embroiled in all of these political machinations. However, even the expense incurred in relation to those simply isn't that large in the grand scheme of things. It's hardly going to create their profit margin of, say, 4%. It's not going to raise their profit margin exponentially. It would just shift things at the margins. And as a result, even then, when they're doing this wasteful expenditure on some things, it probably would not be all that's behind the rising costs of groceries and the like. Now, of course, supermarkets do play hardball with suppliers. There are myriad stories of suppliers being treated incredibly badly, of tough price negotiations, of difficulties getting cash back, especially if you're trying to get it back earlier than the terms of trade would have otherwise allowed. Furthermore, there are hard terms imposed across all suppliers. No doubt, farmers do not receive a good deal. Farmers do not receive enough for their produce. Supermarkets do seem to treat them badly, and suppliers appear to be very concerned about reporting bad behaviour lest they be blacklisted. However, while these supermarkets have treated their suppliers badly, this doesn't mean that supermarkets are actually that profitable, and in fact they might be unprofitable if they didn't engage in those negotiations. This is because it's expensive to run a supermarket. Just think about the cost of rent, electricity, labour, everything else has gone up. Supermarkets incur large costs. Furthermore, there's food spoilage and theft, because not all food sells. And now they might be able to predict with a decent degree of accuracy what will sell, but they're still going to have food wastage. They're still going to have theft. They're still going to have things break. They're going to have situations where supermarkets simply are going through significant expenses, all of which have gone up massively. Electricity has gone up massively, and it's the same for the commercial sector, much like it is for the residential sector. Similarly, the cost of labour has also increased. Everything has gone up in cost. Supermarkets, therefore, are an expensive business to run. Hiring all of those employees, running that advertising, doing all of that isn't cheap. Hence why supermarkets, despite treating farmers badly, aren't necessarily that profitable. This whole situation actually seems to be a function of competition. Now, Coles and Woolworths are argued to have a duopoly, and in some cases they somewhat do. And they control most of the supermarket sector. Aldi reportedly controls about 10% of the market share. However, that doesn't tell us the full story. Because when you're looking at Coles and Woolworths, the prices are generally consistent across all outlets in the state. The price in Sydney CBD will be the same as the price in the outer suburbs in Sydney. This means that Coles needs to be able to set prices so it can compete in the most competitive market, because that most competitive market is going to set the prices more generally. Therefore, Aldi need only compete in some markets for them to have an impact on Coles and or Woolworths. That is, the presence of Aldi and IGA and myriad other competitors can actually have an outsized impact on the profits. Now, this isn't to say that there's necessarily a lot of competition. People can't necessarily always go to all of Coles, Woolworths, Aldi and IGA, but typically there's at least a couple that are within a similar distance from one another, meaning that consumers do have options. Consumers probably prefer to shop at one particular location, but they absolutely do have options if one of the supermarkets is deviating from the price competition. So therefore, while it is right to call out supermarket misbehaviour, while it's right to call out wastage, while it's right to call out supermarkets for treating farmers and suppliers badly, our criticism should be fact-based rather than simply scapegoating Coles and Woolworths for other broader failures. Inflation isn't the fault of Coles and Woolworths. Inflation is the fault of myriad other things, which can include government fiscal policy. And the government is trying to confect a narrative to shift the blame for inflation from itself and from other things onto the supermarkets. The government effectively is trying to scapegoat, and the government is trying to distract people by blaming big bad boogeymen for what's going on in the economy, rather than letting people focus on the government's own failings. Hopefully people can see through that.